Most empaths believe they're evolving. They set boundaries. They learn to say no. They start protecting their energy and calling it growth. And by every visible measure, they are growing. But Carl Jung mapped something most people never hear about, a final stage of empathic development so rare, so psychologically demanding, that the vast majority of empaths will live and die without ever touching it. He called it the Sophia stage, and the reason most empaths never reach it has nothing to do with how sensitive they are, how much shadow work they've done, or how many toxic relationships they've walked away from. It has to do with something far more uncomfortable, something most empaths refuse to face even after they've faced everything else. The first three stages are where most empaths get permanently stuck, not because they lack ability, but because reaching the fourth stage, Sophia, requires a sacrifice so counterintuitive that almost no one is willing to make it. It requires giving up the very identity that empathy gave them. Today I'm going to walk you through the 4 stages Jung identified, show you exactly where most empaths get trapped and why, reveal what the Sophia stage actually looks like when someone reaches it, and explain why it demands the one thing empaths are most terrified of losing. If you've been doing the inner work for years and something still feels incomplete, like you've healed but haven't arrived, like you've grown but haven't transformed, Jung would tell you that you're sensing the gap between where you are and where Sophia lives. And that gap is the most important distance you'll ever cross. Jung didn't stumble onto these stages randomly. He observed them across hundreds of patients over decades of practice, watching how the inner feminine principle, the part of the psyche responsible for relatedness, feeling, intuition, and wisdom, matured through specific phases. Each phase changed how a person experienced themselves and everyone around them, and each phase felt like the final destination until the next one shattered it. The first stage Jung identified was Eve. This is where empathic consciousness begins, and it's entirely biological. The empath at the Eve stage experiences the world through raw sensation and instinct. They feel everything but understand nothing about what they're feeling. Emotions hit them like weather, unpredictable, overwhelming, impossible to navigate. They absorb the moods of every room they enter. They take on other people's pain without knowing they're doing it. They confuse other people's emotions with their own and spend years in therapy trying to fix feelings that were never theirs to begin with. Most empaths remember this stage vividly because it's where the suffering is loudest. The child who couldn't be in a grocery store without being flooded by strangers' anxiety. The teenager who felt physically sick around certain people but couldn't explain why. The young adult who kept attracting wounded, chaotic partners because their nervous system was calibrated to detect and respond to pain. At the Eve stage, empathic ability is pure biology. The nervous system is wide open, the boundaries are non-existent, and the empath has no framework for understanding what's happening to them. Empaths at this stage often get misdiagnosed: anxiety disorders, depression, borderline traits, codependency. Because from the outside, an empath drowning in everyone else's emotions looks like someone with a psychological disorder. And in a sense, they do have a disorder, but it's a disorder of perception, not pathology. Their system is receiving accurate information. They just have no way to process or organize it. They're like a radio pulling in every frequency at once with no way to tune to a single station. The breakthrough out of the Eve stage comes when the empath finally learns to distinguish their feelings from what they're absorbing. When they realize that the depression that hits every time they visit their mother isn't their depression. When they understand that the anxiety they feel at work belongs to their coworker, not to them. This recognition, that much of what they feel isn't theirs, is the doorway out of the first stage. And many empaths celebrate this recognition as if it's the finish line. But Jung would tell them they've barely started. The second stage is Helen. Named after Helen of Troy, this stage represents the romanticization of empathic identity. The empath who reaches the Helen stage has learned to name what they are. They call themselves an empath. They read about it, study it, build community around it. They begin to see their sensitivity not as a curse, but as a gift. They develop language for their experience. They learn about energy, about boundaries, about narcissists and toxic dynamics. They start to feel special, chosen, different from ordinary people in a meaningful way. Jung observed that the Helen stage is intoxicating because it replaces suffering with significance. The same sensitivity that caused so much pain now becomes a source of identity and even pride. The empath begins to see themselves as uniquely perceptive, spiritually advanced, capable of seeing what others miss. They attract other empaths and form communities built around shared identity. They consume content about empaths, videos, books, courses, and each piece of content reinforces their specialness. This is where most of the spiritual empath community lives, and Jung would have had serious concerns about that, because the Helen stage, for all its relief and belonging, is a trap. The empath has stopped drowning in their sensitivity, which is genuine progress, but they've replaced unconscious suffering with conscious identification. They've made empathy their identity rather than their capacity. And when empathy becomes identity, it becomes something you have to protect, perform, and defend rather than something you develop, refine, and transcend. Jung found that empaths at the Helen stage develop a subtle but powerful resistance to further growth, because further growth would require them to question the very identity that saved them from the chaos of the Eve stage. It would require them to examine the ego investment in being an empath, to ask uncomfortable questions like, am I using my sensitivity to avoid my own shadow? Is my identification as an empath keeping me in a victim position? Am I more attached to being special than to being whole? These questions feel like betrayal at the Helen stage. They feel like going backwards. The empath fought so hard to claim their identity, and now someone's suggesting they need to release it? Jung understood this resistance intimately. He saw it in patient after patient. The person who'd found a framework that explained their suffering and then refused to outgrow that framework because outgrowing it meant losing the explanation that finally made sense of their life. But the Helen stage has a ceiling, and empaths hit it when they realize that understanding their patterns hasn't actually freed them from those patterns. They can name the dynamic with their narcissistic parent but still get triggered by it. They can identify an energy vampire but still feel drained after the encounter. They know the language of healing but haven't experienced the transformation the language describes. They've intellectualized empathy without metabolizing it, and that gap between knowing and being is what creates the pressure to move into the third stage. The third stage is Mary, and this is where things get genuinely difficult. Jung named this stage after the archetype of the devoted spiritual mother, the principle of selfless love, sacrifice, and spiritual aspiration. The empath who enters the Mary stage has moved beyond identity and into genuine inner work. They're not just calling themselves an empath anymore, they're actively confronting their shadow. They're sitting with their wounds instead of just naming them. They're doing the brutal psychological labor of integration. At the Mary stage, the empath begins to develop real discernment rather than reactive sensitivity. They start to see their own shadow clearly, the ways their empathy served their ego, the ways their helping was actually controlling, the ways their sensitivity kept them in a superior position. They face the devastating recognition that their compulsive caregiving wasn't always love. Sometimes it was a way to avoid their own emptiness. Sometimes it was a transaction. I'll feel your pain if you'll need me. Sometimes it was the only way they knew how to feel valuable. This confrontation is excruciating. Jung observed that empaths in the Mary stage often went through what looked like a dark night of the soul. Everything they believed about themselves was being dismantled. The narrative of the pure-hearted empath surrounded by toxic people started to crack. They began to see their own toxicity, their own manipulation, their own unconsciousness. And unlike the Helen stage, where they could intellectualize these patterns from a safe distance, the Mary stage required them to feel the full weight of their complicity. Jung found that the Mary stage is where most empaths who do genuine work reach their final resting place. And it's not a bad resting place. An empath who has truly integrated their shadow, who has faced their own darkness, who has developed real discernment and genuine boundaries, that person is psychologically healthier than 90% of the population. They've done extraordinary work. They've earned a level of consciousness that most people never approach. But the Mary stage is still not Sophia, and the difference between them is the difference between healing and wisdom, between becoming healthy and becoming whole, between recovering from your wounds and transcending the framework of woundedness entirely. The Mary stage heals the empath. The Sophia stage transforms what empathy actually is. So what is the Sophia stage? And why do so few empaths ever reach it? Jung describes Sophia as divine wisdom, not in the religious sense, but in the psychological sense of a consciousness that is moved beyond personal experience into something transpersonal. The empath who reaches the Sophia stage has done something that sounds simple, but is almost impossibly difficult. They've released their attachment to being an empath entirely, not suppressed it, not denied it, not rejected their sensitivity. They've integrated it so completely that it's no longer a separate identity. It's no longer something they are. It becomes something that moves through them. The difference is like the difference between someone who says, "I am anger," and someone who says, "Anger is moving through me." One is identified, the other is aware. And that shift from identification to awareness is the doorway to Sophia. Jung observed that empaths at the Sophia stage experienced perception without attachment. They could feel the full depth of human suffering without being destroyed by it. They could see someone's shadow clearly without needing to fix it, heal it, or even comment on it. They could sit with pain, their own and others, without the compulsive need to do something about it. They had developed what Jung would have called a witnessing consciousness, an ability to perceive everything while being enslaved by nothing. This sounds peaceful, and in a sense it is, but it's not the saccharine peace of the spiritual marketplace. It's the peace of someone who has been through psychological fire and come out the other side with nothing left to burn. The empath at the Sophia stage isn't calm because they've transcended difficulty. They're calm because they've stopped fighting reality. They've stopped needing the world to be different than it is. They've stopped needing people to be different than they are. They've stopped needing themselves to be different than they are. And this is precisely why most empaths never get there. Because getting there requires giving up the need to heal the world. That sentence deserves to sit for a moment. The need to heal the world is the empath's deepest attachment. It's deeper than their attachment to relationships, deeper than their attachment to identity, deeper than their attachment to being understood. The belief that they exist to help, to heal, to see what others can't see and use that sight to fix what's broken. This is the core operating system of the empath at every stage before Sophia. And Sophia requires that operating system to die. Jung was very specific about what this death looks like. It's not that the Sophia stage empath stops caring. They care more deeply than they ever have. It's that they stop making their caring into a mission. They stop treating their perception as a mandate. They stop believing that seeing someone's pain obligates them to carry it, address it, or transform it. They see everything. They carry nothing. Not out of coldness, out of a wisdom that understands something the earlier stages cannot grasp, that each person's suffering is their own sacred territory, and entering that territory uninvited, no matter how good your intentions, is a violation of their psychological sovereignty. This insight devastates empaths when they first encounter it, because it means that the thing they've been doing their entire lives, the helping, the absorbing, the carrying of others' pain, wasn't always love. Sometimes it was a subtle form of trespass, a way of saying, "I know what you need better than you do," a way of maintaining the position of the one who sees, the one who knows, the one who heals. And that position, however noble it looks from the outside, is still an ego position. It's still about being someone specific in the dynamic. And Sophia asks you to be no one. Being no one doesn't mean being invisible or insignificant. It means being free from the need to occupy a defined role in every interaction. The empath at the Sophia stage can be present without being the healer, can listen without diagnosing, can witness without intervening, can love without needing to fix what they love. This freedom is so foreign to most empaths that it feels like a loss rather than a liberation. They've spent their lives defined by their capacity to feel and respond to others' pain. Who are they if they stop responding? And there's something worth pausing on here. If you've been walking this path, doing the inner work, sitting with your shadow, trying to understand who you are beneath the roles you've played, you already know how disorienting that question is. Who am I without the helping? Who am I without the seeing? It's the kind of question that doesn't answer itself quickly. It asks you to sit in the unknown long enough for something real to emerge. Our guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for exactly this kind of passage. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's teachings, each one designed to help you find your way within when the familiar markers have fallen away. You'll find the link below. But for now, let's go deeper into what makes this stage so demanding. Jung mapped a specific psychological barrier that prevents empaths from crossing into Sophia, and he found it in the most unexpected place. It wasn't fear. It wasn't trauma. It wasn't lack of awareness. It was grief. Specifically, the grief of releasing the myth of the healer. Every empath carries a story about why they're here. That story usually involves being a source of healing for others. They came into a broken family and became the emotional stabilizer. They entered a chaotic world and became the one who could sense what was wrong and try to make it right. This story isn't just a narrative, it's the empath's origin myth. It's the meaning they've assigned to their suffering, and it's the reason they survived. If I suffered this much, it must be for a purpose, and the purpose must be to help others who are suffering. Jung observed that this narrative was psychologically brilliant as a survival mechanism. It took unbearable childhood pain and transmuted it into meaning. It gave the empath a reason to exist when their environment was giving them every reason to believe they shouldn't. The myth of the healer saved them, and now Sophia asks them to release it. This is why grief is the gateway. You can't think your way past this barrier. You can't intellectualize it. You have to mourn the story that saved you. You have to grieve the identity that gave your suffering meaning. And you have to do this without replacing it with a new story, a new identity, a new purpose. You have to stand in the void where the myth of the healer used to be, and tolerate the emptiness long enough for something else to grow. Jung called this process a kind of psychological death that precedes genuine rebirth. But most empaths, when they feel this death approaching, retreat back into the merry stage. They find someone new to help. They discover a new cause. They throw themselves into another person's healing process because the alternative, sitting with their own purposelessness, is too terrifying. And each retreat reinforces the barrier. Each return to helping delays the crossing into Sophia by another season, another year, another decade. There's another dimension to why empaths get stuck before Sophia, and Jung found it embedded in the empath's relationship with their own body of knowledge. By the time an empath reaches the threshold of the fourth stage, they know a lot. They understand attachment theory, shadow dynamics, narcissistic patterns, trauma responses, energy management, boundary setting. They've accumulated an impressive psychological vocabulary and a sophisticated framework for understanding human behavior. And this knowledge becomes its own prison. Because the Sophia stage doesn't require more knowledge, it requires the willingness to not know. It requires what Zen practitioners call beginner's mind, the capacity to encounter each moment, each person, each situation as if you've never seen anything like it before. The empath who knows too much approaches every interaction with their framework already in place. They see someone and immediately categorize: avoidant attachment, narcissistic wound, unintegrated shadow. The diagnosis is instantaneous and often accurate, but the diagnosis is also a wall between the empath and the actual living reality of the person in front of them. Sophia asks the empath to put down the diagnostic lens and simply be present with what is. Not what they know it is, not what they can categorize it as, not what pattern it fits, just what it actually is in this unrepeatable moment. This is perception without framework, awareness without agenda, seeing without the filter of accumulated knowledge. And for an empath who has spent years building that filter as protection against the chaos of the Eve stage, putting it down feels like walking into a burning building without a fire suit. Jung found that empaths who successfully crossed into the Sophia stage often described the experience as paradoxical. They said they could see more clearly than ever before, yet they felt like they knew less than ever before. Their perception had become sharper, more refined, more penetrating, but it was no longer organized around the need to understand, diagnose, or help. It had become what Jung described as pure witnessing. the capacity to be fully present with reality without needing reality to be anything other than what it is. This witnessing consciousness is the essence of the Sophia stage, and it's what makes the Sophia stage empath fundamentally different from empaths at every previous stage. At Eve, the empath is overwhelmed by perception. At Helen, the empath romanticizes perception. At Mary, the empath purifies perception through shadow work. At Sophia, the empath rests in perception itself. Perception becomes home rather than burden. Seeing becomes its own completion rather than a call to action. Empaths at the Sophia stage had a strange effect on the people around them. Without trying to heal anyone, without offering advice or insight or diagnosis, their mere presence seemed to create space for others to heal themselves. People would sit with a Sophia stage empath and spontaneously begin to see their own patterns. Not because the empath pointed them out, because the empath's unattached awareness created an environment where truth could surface naturally. Jung found this deeply significant. It suggested that the empath's greatest healing power wasn't in their doing, it was in their being. That all the years of compulsive helping had actually been a lesser form of the gift. The real gift, the one that only emerged at Sophia, was the capacity to be so fully present, so completely non-reactive, so genuinely unattached to outcome that other people's psyches could relax in your presence and begin to organize themselves. This is counterintuitive to everything empaths have been taught. They've been told their value lies in what they do for others, the emotional labor, the holding space, the seeing and naming and healing. But Jung's framework suggests that all of that doing, however well-intentioned, contains a subtle interference. The empath's agenda, even the agenda of helping, creates a field that shapes what can emerge in the interaction. When that agenda dissolves, which only happens at Sophia, the interaction becomes truly free. And in that freedom, far deeper healing becomes possible than anything the empath could have engineered. There's a specific fear that keeps empaths from trusting this. If I stop actively helping, nothing will happen. People will suffer, and I'll just be watching. My sensitivity will become useless. I'll become cold, detached, disconnected from my own heart. Jung addressed this fear directly. He emphasized that the Sophia stage isn't detachment from feeling. It's the deepest form of feeling that exists. The empath at Sophia feels everything more intensely than they ever have. But they've developed the internal spaciousness to contain that feeling without being commanded by it. At every previous stage, the empath's feeling creates a reaction. They feel someone's pain and they respond, absorbing it, analyzing it, trying to fix it, setting a boundary against it. At Sophia, they feel someone's pain and they stay. They don't react, they don't flee, they don't fix. They stay present with the feeling and with the person, offering nothing but their full attention. And that full attention, stripped of agenda, stripped of the need to rescue or repair, is the most powerful thing one human being can offer another. Jung would have recognized this as the difference between sympathy, empathy, and wisdom. Sympathy feels with someone and gets pulled in. Empathy feels with someone and maintains boundaries. Wisdom feels with someone and remains free. Each stage is more spacious than the last, and Sophia is the stage where spaciousness becomes infinite, where the empath's capacity to feel is no longer limited by the need to do something with what they feel. So, how does an empath begin to approach the Sophia stage? Jung didn't offer a simple practice or technique because the crossing into Sophia isn't mechanical, it's organic. It happens when the psyche is ready, and it can't be forced. But he did identify conditions that make the crossing more likely. The first condition is saturation with helping. The empath has to reach a point where they've helped enough, healed enough, intervened enough to recognize that their helping hasn't fundamentally changed the pattern. People they've helped fall back into old dynamics. Situations they've stabilized destabilize again. The world they've been trying to fix remains stubbornly broken. This isn't cynicism, it's realism, and it creates the disillusionment necessary to question the entire framework of helping as purpose. The second condition is confrontation with the healer's shadow. The empath has to see, with unflinching honesty, the ways their healing work served their ego. the superiority embedded in always being the wise one, the control embedded in managing others' emotional states, the avoidance embedded in focusing on everyone else's wounds instead of sitting with their own emptiness. This confrontation is the deepest shadow work the empath will ever do, because it targets the one identity they thought was sacred. The third condition is what Jung described as the tolerance of meaninglessness. The empath has to be willing to exist without purpose, without mission, without the story that their suffering made them a healer and their healing makes their suffering worthwhile. They have to sit in the terrifying possibility that their suffering meant nothing, that their sensitivity isn't a calling, that they're not here for any special reason. This tolerance of meaninglessness isn't nihilism. It's the psyche's way of clearing space for meaning that comes from a deeper source than the ego's need for purpose. The fourth condition is solitude, not loneliness, not isolation born from rejection, chosen solitude. Extended periods of being alone with their own consciousness, without the distraction of others' emotional needs. Jung found that empaths who eventually reached Sophia had all gone through periods of significant withdrawal, not because they were depressed, but because their psyche was restructuring. It was dismantling the old operating system and building something entirely new. And that process required silence, stillness, and the absence of external emotional input. These four conditions, saturation, shadow confrontation, tolerance of meaninglessness, and chosen solitude, create the psychological environment where the crossing into Sophia becomes possible. Not guaranteed, possible. Because ultimately, the Sophia stage isn't something you achieve. It's something that emerges when everything that isn't Sophia has been released. And this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about why most empaths never reach it. It's not that they fail, it's that they stop. They reach a stage of healing that's genuinely good, the Mary stage, where they've integrated their shadow and developed real boundaries and earned authentic self-knowledge. And they decide that's enough. And for most people, it is enough. There's nothing wrong with living fully in the Mary stage. It's a profound level of consciousness that most humans never achieve. But some empaths feel the pull beyond it. They feel something calling from past their healing, past their identity, past everything they've built. Something that whispers, there's more. Not more to learn, not more to heal, more to release. And if you're feeling that pull, if something in you recognized itself in the description of Sophia, if you've been sensing that your current level of growth is genuine but incomplete, that pull is the Sophia stage calling. Jung would tell you not to chase it. The Sophia stage can't be pursued the way you pursue healing or knowledge or growth. It can only be allowed. You create the conditions, you do the releasing, you sit in the emptiness, and you wait. Not passively, actively. You actively surrender the need to be someone, to do something, to mean something. And in that active surrender, something ancient and vast begins to stir. That stirring is Sophia. It's the wisdom that exists beneath all the knowledge you've accumulated, the perception that exists beneath all the frameworks you've built, the love that exists beneath all the helping you've done. It was always there, but it was buried under layers of identity, purpose, and the desperate need to make your sensitivity mean something. The Sophia stage doesn't make your sensitivity mean something. It reveals that your sensitivity was always meaningful, not because of what you did with it, but because of what it is. Pure awareness, undistorted perception, the capacity to meet reality exactly as it is, without flinching, without fleeing, without needing to change a single thing. That capacity is the rarest thing a human consciousness can develop, and it doesn't come from trying harder. It comes from finally, completely letting go. Most empaths never reach the Sophia stage because they can't let go of the stages that saved them, the boundaries that protected them, the identity that gave them meaning, the knowledge that made sense of their pain, the mission that made their suffering worthwhile. Each of these things was necessary. Each of these things was real progress. But each of these things also becomes a barrier when held too tightly. Sophia lives on the other side of everything you're holding on to, not on the other side of what hurts you. You've already released that. On the other side of what saved you. That's the final paradox. The medicine becomes the last obstacle. The identity that healed you becomes the final thing that must die. And the empath who can face that death, who can grieve the healer, mourn the seer, release the one who is always trying to make things better, that empath enters a psychological space so vast and quiet and clear that everything they thought empathy was dissolves into what empathy actually is. Not feeling other people's pain, not seeing what's hidden, not healing what's broken, just being present, fully, completely, unconditionally present with whatever is, and discovering that presence itself, without agenda, without identity, without purpose, is the most transformative force that exists. That's the Sophia stage. That's what Jung mapped at the peak of the inner feminine's development. That's what most empaths never reach. And that's what's waiting for every empath willing to release everything they think they are in service of discovering what they've always been. If you haven't yet, and you're feeling the pull toward something deeper, toward the kind of inner work that doesn't just heal old wounds, but reveals who you are beneath them, our guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, each one designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.